one of the things we do here at the McKinsey Global Institute is to combine economic research with the insights that we get from some of the clients that the consulting arm of McKinsey deals with. And so all of that is sort of baked into our research, and we kind of get this corporate perspective on what's going on, which I think is important because, economists can advise and policymakers can make policy, but ultimately it's the corporations that respond to those sorts of things and respond to changes in the environment and make decisions that affect things like investment and job creation. So let's start with, so let's go to the next slide. So this is, let's start with jobs, because typically when we talk about manufacturing, we end up talking about jobs, or at least we kind of start off talking about jobs. And this is the famous chart that shows you the millions of US workers that were employed in the manufacturing sector. I've taken a slightly longer perspective here, going back to 1960, and you can see that for about 40 years, we employed about 17 to 18 million workers in the US manufacturing sector. Now, of course, the share of workers employed in manufacturing declined during that time, even though the number is held steady because the economy was shifting to services and for well-documented reasons. But this puts the collapse post-2000 in some pretty stark context, right? And so this is the 1/3 of manufacturing jobs lost in that little gray bar between 2000 and 2010, and you've seen a little bit of a rebound, but not enough to make up for all of that. Now, when you look at a chart like this, the first instinct you have is to figure out, okay, what the hell happened in 2000, right? Why did everybody suddenly leave? Why did all the jobs disappear? And it's important to note from a corporate perspective, companies don't turn on a dime, right? When you see this sort of a trend beginning in 2000, there were trends building in the economy for years, decades before that sort of brought things to a tipping point in 2000. And so what were some of those things? Well, if you think back to the 80s and 90s, one of the things that happened was that the US manufacturing sector started to become much more exposed to foreign competition. So for instance, by 1990, more than half of all the clothing that was sold in the US was made overseas. By 1990, the vast majority of the electronics market in the US was dominated by Japanese firms. Right? So these are things that started to happen well before 2000. You also saw the reverse version of that is US firms seeing much more export growth. So the share of foreign profits in US corporate profits more than doubled to about 20% or so in the 1990s. Now, all of that put together meant that in the 80s, and to some extent in the 90s as well, corporations in the US saw a lot of pressure, a lot of competitive pressure. So the corporate profits as a share of GDP in the US was quite low through much of the 80s. And that created incentives for companies to start using some of these newer technologies that were coming along, IT systems, for instance, to start to vertically specialize, to start to sort of disaggregate their value chains, right? To start to figure out how do I focus on the highest value activities? How do I outsource or offshore or automate low value activities? And all of that was going on. So you have to kind of keep all of that in mind. That's been going on for 20, 25 years before we get to 2000. It also doesn't help in this situation if you have an economy that's becoming more and more exposed to the foreign market. The US dollar started to strengthen post-1995 for the first time in 14 years. And so that, the sensitivity of the US manufacturing sector was much higher when that started to happen in the mid-90s. Now, if you go to the next slide, that collapse that you saw between 2000 and 2010 played out differently in different industries. And that's one of the things that we try to call out in our research. All manufacturing is not the same, as Rob alluded to. It's tempting to try to identify a single cause that identifies the collapse, and it's just as tempting to find a single solution that will bring everything back. Unfortunately, reality doesn't quite work that way. What we did here was to say, all right, if you can't find a single solution, do you really have to deal with the 30-odd manufacturing industries at the 2 or 3 digit level? Do you have to deal with a policy for cat and dog food manufacturing versus tortilla manufacturing? And luckily, you don't have to do that. This is a chart that shows you what we did here was to take some of the big manufacturing industries and classify them based on some of the shared characteristics that companies in these industries have. So you look at the extent of tradability, the extent of labor intensity, the extent of invested capital. And what you see is a few interesting trends. So right at the bottom, you see labor-intensive tradables. These are some of the big apparel industries where you did see, as retailers started to consolidate in the US, you saw much more sourcing coming in from overseas. And you can sort of see in the little brown bars an acceleration of that trend as the US entered a recession, retailers saw price pressures, and they responded to that by sourcing much more from lower cost locations. A different trend from the green line which is electronics, where you actually see that US employment was rising until about 2000 or so. And then you had the combined effect of the 2001 recession and the entry of China into the World Trade Organization, which primarily benefited Japanese companies, which, as I'd mentioned, had a pretty significant market share in the US by then. And so the Japanese sort of saw an opportunity to expand their supply chain beyond Korea and Taiwan into China as well. And so that's contributed quite significantly. But you can see there that the green line really trended downwards in the 2000 to 2004 period. And since then, it's sort of continued a gradual downward trend, but it's not as significant as it was back then. And then to me, the most interesting aspects of the top two lines, the blue and the orange lines, these are what I call regionally processed industries and global innovation, sort of heavy industrial goods. Think about industries that locate their production pretty close to where they finally sell their products. These are not industries that these are not products that you can make in one corner of the world and ship all around the world. These are extremely labor-intensive industries that didn't lose all that many jobs. And so this is not just a labor cost story. What you'll see here, to Rob's point, is that these are the industries where you saw US competitiveness decline significantly in the last decade. You saw a combination of demand falling domestically and export demand falling for US-made goods. And you'll see that in more detail on the next slide if you flip over. Here's a chart that shows you real output in US manufacturing versus productivity growth. And you can see here that it's not as though productivity growth, the dark blue lines, suddenly spiked in the last decade. If anything, in fact, over the last 10 years or so, productivity growth has been slowing considerably. But what happened was that the demand for US-made goods collapsed. And that's a combination of the fact that households were not earning as much, businesses weren't investing enough. What market there was in the US was increasingly being taken over by foreign firms. And so you saw US car companies, for instance, saw their market share go from 70% to 45% in this time period. And exports were hit as well. And so all of these things start to matter. So it's helpful to at least keep those 3 or 4 different industry groups in your mind. The labor-intensive tradable industries, the electronics industries, and then these demand-driven industries. Can you go to the next slide, please? Now, over the last 5 years or so, we've had a demand-driven rebound in manufacturing. A lot of people, when it first was going on back in 2010 and 2011, people thought this was reshoring of jobs coming back from places like China. That's really not the case. It was primarily demand-driven rebound, and you can see that in the fact that the vast majority, over 90% of the jobs that were created in the last 4 or 5 years, were created in highly demand-driven industries. And there were 3 or 4 industries: cars, machines, food and beverage. Those are not industries that went to China to serve the US market. Those were industries that lost value here in the US and saw some of that demand coming back. And as you can imagine, in the last couple of years, as that demand rebound has petered out, the job creation has also petered out. Now, the issue, though, is that even as that demand has come back, the trade deficit has actually widened. This is a chart that shows you just advanced industries, so just sort of the R&D intensive manufacturing industries, where from a comparative advantage standpoint, the economic theory would tell you that the US should have a huge advantage. And instead, the US is the only country other than the UK to run a massive and growing trade deficit in these sorts of industries. And so we're talking about cars, machines, aircraft, although aircraft we do have a surplus. And you can see here that, again, there's a handful of industries that are driving the trade deficit. What we hear from our clients now is that the combination of these trends over the last 2 or 3 decades has resulted in supply chain gaps in the US. And so even as large companies want to come to the US because these are demand-driven industries, as they come to the US to locate here to take advantage of the growth in domestic demand, often they can't find suppliers who can scale up, who have the capacity to meet the sorts of demand requirements. And so you end up increasing the trade deficit. Now, let me pivot. I'm going to close in a couple of slides. I've talked about jobs and I've talked about trade. As we think about manufacturing policy, it's useful to take a step back and say, why is manufacturing important? I personally don't buy the idea that manufacturing is not important to an economy. It is critical to an economy. But we often talk about it in terms of jobs. It's important for much more than jobs. And if you go to the next slide, you'll see that here. If you look at the numbers on the far right, this is for the US, but you see the same trends for most of the rest of the world as well. So in the US, manufacturing makes up roughly about 10% of the economy, measured in terms of GDP or in terms of jobs. It drives about 1/3 of all the productivity growth in this economy. It makes up about 60% of all the exports. It makes up about 70% of all the private sector R&D in this country. And if you think a minute about what drives national competitiveness, what drives a country to become more competitive, to raise living standards, it's these things, right? It's the productivity growth that you see. It's the innovation that you see in the economy. It's the exports that you see coming out of the economy. These are all indicators of how competitive a country is, and manufacturing punches way above its weight when it comes to those sorts of indicators. And so as we're thinking about revitalizing the manufacturing ecosystem or bringing jobs back, it's also important to keep these indicators in mind and make sure that we're not harming these indicators by focusing on just a single indicator. So let me close with just a couple of ideas for what I would think are our priorities for manufacturing. Certainly, we want to focus on jobs. Jobs come when there's investment. Investment comes when there's broad-based growth. And broad-based growth is driven by productivity growth. And so if you can find ways to improve manufacturing productivity and you realize value from that productivity, productivity at the end of the day is basically wealth creation, right? It is the extent to which you can create wealth out of a given set of inputs. The more wealth you create from the same inputs, the higher the productivity. If that wealth is shared in a broad-based way, you end up creating broad-based demand, which in turn, as we saw, fuels a very large range of manufacturing industries. And so if there's a way for us to be able to revitalize that productivity growth, particularly among smaller and medium-sized firms, where there's a lot of evidence that they've been lagging further and further behind that productivity frontier, that is certainly something that we should be focusing on. As part of that, I would also call out services and broadly the issue of exports. The US export to GDP ratio is relatively low compared to most advanced economies. The number of US firms, about 30 million or so registered companies in the US, the share of those that export is again relatively low. The US Commerce Department estimates it to be less than 1% of all US companies that export. And there are clear links between companies that export and the wages that those workers are paid, the productivity that those companies see, and the growth that those companies see in terms of revenues. And so if we could do something on exports, keeping in mind that a lot of the value accruing in the manufacturing value chain increasingly is not in the production activity itself, but in the services activities. And that includes both pre-production in terms of design and also post-production in terms of servicing. And so we need to keep that in mind as well as we're pushing on exports. And then finally, on technology and digital investments, this is something where the manufacturing sector is lagging. We think these are ways, again, for small and mid-sized firms, if you can find a way to shore up their capital investment, give them the digital tools that they need, or give them incentives to invest, that will help them improve efficiencies, create more broad-based prosperity, and that can help drive growth. And a last point before I end, we do need to address dislocation. For too long, we've been talking about the fact that we need to retrain these workers. Retraining certainly is one aspect of it, but we're dealing with an environment where manufacturing industries tend to employ older workers. We're dealing with an environment where mobility has fallen in half in the last 20 years across cities. And so, it may not be enough to just think about this in terms of retraining, and it's certainly not a one-size-fits-all. There are some industries in manufacturing where more than a third of workers are over the age of 55. And so we do need to have a broader discussion about what are some of the things that we can do to alleviate the kinds of dislocations being caused by manufacturing job loss. Great. Right.
Thank you, Sree.